If everybody's ready, I think we can get started. So essentially today we're going to be learning about how to build a very basic website. And as you may have seen in the description, the website is going to be based on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So to those of you who don't know, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I'll write them out here. There are three programming languages. I guess some people say they're not, but I like to think of them as three different languages. And they basically play three different roles in creating your website. So if I go to a random website on my browser here, like Google is serving a combination of both HTML and CSS and also some JavaScript to do three different roles. And the roles that they are, I like to do an analogy when I'm trying to explain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So HTML essentially is like the skeleton of your website. So what that basically means is that HTML, if you imagine like a human body, the skeleton basically defines the basic lengths of our bones and then also like the basic proportions of the human body. And in terms of a website, that might be determining, different types of content on your website and then what's inside that content, but it won't do anything more than just basic structure. And then from there, you have some CSS. So CSS, I like to equate to the skin or maybe some other like aesthetic features. So CSS, I'll call it the skin here. And it's what goes on top of the HTML to make it look better. It allows you to do some more sizing and proportion, and it allows you to do more things that are related to aesthetic features of your website. And then JavaScript finally is like the muscles and the nerves. So what I mean by muscles and nerves is that, the human body with only skeleton and skin won't be able to do anything. It'll just be some static, obviously without bones, I don't even think we would be able to stand, or without muscles, we wouldn't even be able to stand. So with just a skeleton and a skin, you would have like a very basic website that might just have some text and have some, fancy colors. But JavaScript is really what makes your website tick and makes it do more interactive things that you might need for something more advanced. So we see these three things, and then they all talk to each other. So all three of these can have connections to each other. And so all of them will talk to each other, and we'll see how they talk to each other in a bit. And so when we talk about a website, we talk about all three of these things. And so today we'll be doing all three of these things. And so if you want to follow along to this workshop, it's definitely not necessary since it might be a bit of, it might be too fast for somebody who like just started programming. But if you want to follow along, there's this website called JS Fiddle. And on here, you can edit HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if you see I type something here, and I think I might have to save it. Yeah, so if you hit Control-S to save, it'll show up here. So this is your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then here's what is actually your website. What I'll be using is something called Visual Studio Code. For those of you who've been doing like programming for a while, you probably know that this is it's pretty much a text editor, but a lot of people use it for more than that. And if you're following along with JS Fiddle, just whenever I'm editing the HTML file, edit the HTML blocks, and the same thing for CSS and JavaScript. And so we'll start off by creating a page called index.html. A lot of the times the file names that you give to your programs, maybe if you've done like Python and things like that, it doesn't really matter. But in terms of HTML especially, index.html has a very special purpose for your website. And so when I went to google.com, essentially what my browser did was Google has their server somewhere in the US, right? And my computer asked Google, give me the file that's index.html. So every single homepage of a website will be index.html. And so from here, we'll start doing some HTML. And essentially the way that HTML works is that we have these things called tags. And the most basic tag is just the HTML tag. So the basic syntax for a tag is you have this less than sign, and then you have some text inside of it, and then you have a greater than sign. And so you also have, this is what's called the opening tag. And then you'll notice that I have another tag down here, which is the closing tag. And so this is the same thing as the opening tag, except there's a slash over here to just denote that this is the closing of a tag. And essentially that the way that this works is that tags basically define like a portion of your website. So anything inside of here would be considered like inside of the HTML tag. So if I were to put another tag, which is called like the head tag, we would say that the head is inside of HTML. And so you can see like some sort of like nesting structure. If you've used like for loops or something in another language, this is sort of like nested code. So the head tag basically contains, if I edit things in the head tag, it usually doesn't show up on the website itself, but it'll actually show up in other places. So we'll come back to that later. The more important tag that you probably would use more often is the body tag. So there's head and body. It's kind of like the head and body of a human body, where the head kind of defines like more attribute level things, and then the body is more of the content of your website. And so I'll start off with a very simple tag, which is the P tag. And so if I do P, we notice that the P tag is inside of body, and P stands for paragraphs. So if I put something inside of here, and you'll notice that hello world isn't really a tag on its own, it's just some content. So you can also do that within HTML. You can put just random text and then it should show up. So right now it's just code, right? But websites, we want to see more than the code. And so if you're using JS Fiddle, if you hit Control S, it should probably just show up there. For those of you who are using VS Code, I recommend using an extension called Live Server. And what Live Server does, if you go to extensions, I'm sure I have it very zoomed in, so you might not have this ... here, but it should look like, I think, this one, these blocks. And if you just search Live Server, it should show up here, and you can just install it. And then if I hit Control Shift P, and then I search Live Server, there's this option to open with Live Server. And then once you have it open, it should show you which port it's running on. And so if I go here, you'll notice I go to localhost : the port that I was shown earlier. So localhost : 5500. And then if I hit enter here, it says hello world. So that's the very basics of HTML, right? So we learned how to do tags, and we also learned how to put something inside of tags. And then from there, a lot of HTML is just repeat of that. So there's different kinds of tags, and there's like a ton. I think W3 Schools has a lot of them. So this is a great resource, w3schools.com, and they have a lot of tutorials on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and many others. And you can see that they have a very similar structure to mine, where it's an HTML tag around everything. This title tag, which we haven't visited yet, an H1 tag, which we're going to visit soon, and then the paragraph tag. So the H1 tag, it stands for header, and so the H stands for header, and then 1 stands for the size of the header. So I'll just call this header 1. And then I'm going to copy this 6 times. You don't actually have to do this if you're following along, but I'm just going to show you H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. And then same thing here. And then if I save this, they all say header 1, it's fine. So if I save this, they'll have different sizes. So when I save this and I go back here and I refresh the page, you'll notice that they all have different sizes. And the way that their size is determined is by the number that's right after the H. So 1 is the largest, and then it goes all the way down to 6, which is the smallest. And so that's the very basics of HTML. And the website that we're going to be building today is this NASA images website. So if I go to, so eventually we're going to be building this website, which is an image retriever that will get a picture and then describe it. And so with our very basic knowledge of HTML, we can already do a good amount of this stuff. Maybe it's not as interactive as something here where a button does something and then, you can actually have some interactive elements, but we can still, add this title here because we know how to add a header. We can also add some text here because we know how to add a paragraph. And the button is another tag, and then an image is another tag. And then also this is just a smaller header, which we can use the same kind of tag. And if you guys ever want to follow along, this is the link for the source code. And so this is basically what I'm going to be basing this entire project off of. So if you ever, get stuck, you can refer to the source code. And I put it in the chat. And so let's start off by just, adding this title, adding a button that might not do anything. And then adding some headers, an image, and then more things. So I'm going to delete everything that's inside the body right now. That was just for testing. And I'll start by creating an h1 tag, which remember is the header tag. And I'll just call this NASA image retriever. And as we might expect, it'll show up here. And similarly, we can do the same thing for a lot of these other ones. So I'm going to add a button, which, as you might expect, it's just the button tag. And I'll just call this show me something. So the text that I put inside of here is what the button will say. And then when I refresh, show me something. Now you'll notice it doesn't do anything because we didn't tell it to do anything. And that's where JavaScript comes in. And we'll see that later. And then I had a smaller header, which was the title of the image. So for now, I'll just call it image title. We'll fill this in later with JavaScript as well. And then an image tag, so before I said that all tags have an opening tag like the body tag and a closing tag, but there's some tags which it doesn't really make sense to have something inside of it. So for a header tag, it does make sense that you might want to put some words inside of a header. For a button, you want to put some words inside of a button. For the body, you might not want to put words inside of it, but you also want to put other tags inside of it. And for elements that it doesn't really make sense to have an opening and a closing tag, so it doesn't really make sense to put something inside of it, we just can use a single tag like this. And img stands for image. And for now, I won't put anything in here, but this is something new to us, right? So earlier we only saw tags where it was just an opening and a closing. I think they call it chevrons, right? And then also some text inside of it. But you'll notice here I have something different, right? So I have this weird something equals something. And so this is what's called an HTML attribute, right? So initially we had the tags, which was just a very general name for the tag, but we also want to sometimes specify some additional data about like each tag. And for images, we might want to specify, what is that image and where is that image coming from? And so that's what SRC stands for. SRC stands for source, and then that's just the URL of the image that we want to display. And so actually, I'll show you an image here. So I'm just copying this link over from the code that I linked. And so I copy this URL. And if we go to this on my browser, you'll notice that it's just an image, right? So now we want to add this image that we see on our browser to our website. And by using the SRC tag, that we can do exactly that. So now I added that h3, which was image title, and I also added this really massive image. So CSS will help us scale this image down because we don't really want such a large image showing up on our website. But for now, I'm going to ignore that, and we're going to add that paragraph tag, which was just the image description. So now, if I refresh, right under this image is the image description. And this is essentially most of the HTML that we need for this website. So it's actually pretty basic, and it's only like 12 lines of code. We can add other stuff later. So this head tag I was going to come back to later. So since we have all the content that we want to show on our website, another thing that you might want to do is like edit what shows up here on the tab. So a lot of these things don't actually, they have a custom thing. So JS Fiddle will say JS Fiddle instead of some random text. And so we want to be able to control this. And the way that you control that is a tag inside of head, which is called the title tag. And then the title tag, I'll just name it as the same title. And then when I add the title tag and I refresh the page, nothing happens into our content because it's inside of the head, right? So the head doesn't actually control what we see inside of our main window, but you'll see that instead of saying localhost 5500, now it says NASA image retriever. And some other things that you might want to do, I won't cover it here, but some of these have images next to them, and that's what's called a favicon. And then other things that you might want to do in the head is, some things for like search engines, you might want to control like what description it shows up here. So if I go to Google and I just look up, HackOR, you see how HackOR has like some text here, and that can be controlled inside of the head tag as well. So that's all the HTML for now that we need. And now we'll cover what the JavaScript side of is. So we want to be able to change what's inside of this image title, and we want to be able to actually put an actual image in here. We want to make this button do something. We also want to change what's inside the description, and that's where JavaScript comes into play. So remember how HTML is the skeleton and JavaScript is the nerves and muscles. So inside of our website, the muscles might be, muscles for humans are, like moving different parts of your body and, blinking your eyes and things like that. So muscles here would be like changing parts of the site. And then nerves are also like, detecting input. And so in our case, the muscles would be changing what image title says and also changing what image description is, also changing which image shows up here, because you remember on the site that I showed you earlier, when I click this button, it also changes the title, the image, and also the description. And so that's where JavaScript comes into play. So I'm going to add a new file. For those of you on JS Fiddle, just start editing in the JavaScript section. And the name for this doesn't matter as much. I like to call, if I'm using just only a single JavaScript file, I'll just call it app.js, and I'll open this up. And JavaScript is most like any of the other languages you might have learned in school or something, which is like, Python or JavaScript. It's Python or Java. And JavaScript is more of like a traditional programming language. And so it might be more familiar than, say, HTML or CSS. And first we want to do, the thing that we want to do is, find out when this button is clicked, right? So right now when I do this button, when I click this button, it doesn't really do anything. And the way that we need to do that first is we need to set up a way for JavaScript to communicate with HTML. And the way that it does that is JavaScript first needs to identify, what am I looking for and what part of the HTML should I be, attaching a nerve to, let's say. And so you could just refer to this as, say, like you could just tell JavaScript, hey, look for a button inside of my HTML and, just listen to any of those buttons. But if I had like two buttons here and this could be like, exit page or something, and let's say you want to have something that exits page, we have no unique way of detecting which button is which. And so we need a way to distinguish between this button and this button. And that's another place where attributes come into play. So there are two very important attributes here. There's ID and there's class. So usually you might see both of them, but in this case, we only will use ID. We might use class for other places, but ID stands for identifier, right? So usually you'll have your own like driver's license, which is your ID, and it's only you can have that ID, right? So like your driver's license, only you can have your driver's license. And so in HTML, what ID means is that only one element in your HTML should have that ID, and it should be unique to that one element. And so we'll just call this, show me, right? And so this string, which is, show-me, will be unique to this button, and no other element in this HTML should have that same ID. So now, if I go into JavaScript, now JavaScript has a way of looking for, hey, which element of my HTML has that ID of show-me? And so we'll use document.getElement by ID, right? So document basically refers to your entire HTML document. So JavaScript has a way, it's basically an object that represents everything inside of your HTML, but we don't want everything, right? So we want to get a certain element in our HTML, right? So get element. And how do we want to get it? We want to get it by its ID. And then we just specify a parameter, which is the string that says show-me. And so what this will give us back is a reference to this button. And then we can use that to say add event listener, right? So an event listener is essentially something that only triggers when a certain event happens. So event listeners, there's a ton of different event listeners. If you want to have, if someone drags on top of your HTML element, if someone presses a key, if someone if someone's mouse enters that element, and there's a ton of them. The one that we'll use now is click. And then what we do from there is we add an event listener. from click, and then VS Code will tell me it wants an event listener, it wants the type of the event listener, and also wants what will happen once the event is clicked. And so this is a sort of more complicated syntax where if you've used other programming languages before, this is basically what's called an anonymous function. And what this basically means is that whenever the button is clicked, we just want to run whatever's inside of here. So when the button is clicked, all of this code within these two curly braces will be executed. And the way that we can print out to the console, so if you use like Python, it's equivalent to the print statement in Python. And we can just say button clicked. And so I save this and I refresh the page. And when I click this, first of all, nothing happens because we don't have the console open. So the way that I usually open the console is Control-Shift-I, but I think that's different across browsers. If you do inspect, if you right-click your page and then you click inspect, it'll bring up these tools here. Can kind of be daunting, but what we want to click on is the console tab. And when I click this button again, it still does nothing, right? And so, we might be confused and we might be, this is often, I do this more than I'd like to admit, but there's one important step that we forgot here. So we would need to tell the website where our JavaScript is located. So right now our browser only knows where index.html is located because remember, index.html is the only thing that the browser will ask for. And to load additional files, we have to explicitly tell our browser to load the JavaScript or the CSS. And so the way that we load JavaScript is we use a script tag. And so inside the script tag, you could actually put JavaScript code here. So I could actually put like the console.log here, which looks kind of weird, right? So like one language inside of the other. But for our purposes, we have our code separated. And we use a similar source attribute on the script tag, which will tell our browser, load a script file from the location app.js, which is the name of this file that we created here. And now when I save this and refresh the page, hopefully when I click it, you see down here, it says button clicked. So now we have a way to detect, we've attached a nerve to this button, right? So we've attached a way for our JavaScript to rerun as soon as the user clicks on this button. And we can do a bunch of cool things with that. So for our purposes, we want to be able to change some part of the website, right? And so first, we also need to have references to what this H3 tag is, what this image tag is, and what this P tag is. And so what we can do is we can add more IDs to things, right? So we can call this image-title. We can give this an ID of, image-img, which is a weird name, but I'll do that now. And then this one will have image-description. And so all four of these elements actually have a unique identifier. And as a rule, they should not be shared across different things. So this, having image-title on both of these things would be illegal because we need one element in our HTML to have a certain ID. So I'll change this back to image-image. And now within here, we can tell our JavaScript, hey, look for this title, this image, and this description, and now we can change it. So the way that we declare a variable inside of our JavaScript is usually using the keyword let. There's also the keyword var, but most of the time you're going to be using let. And what let will do is we can create a new variable, and we'll call this just title. And we'll use a similar syntax that we did above here, right? So document.getElementById. And what I called this was image-title. So now title stores whatever this HTML element is. So now JavaScript knows that, hey, I'm editing this part of the HTML. And for testing purposes, we can just say that title.inner text equals test, right? So this title is an HTML element. VS Code even tells me that it's an HTML element. And I'm editing an attribute called inner text. And inner text is basically, what's inside of this tag. So it would edit anything within here. So now if I refresh the page, Nothing has happened yet. So we have image title still being displayed. And when I click this button, it changes to test. So that's adding a muscle. I'd say that's adding like a muscle when a nerve is triggered, right? So we waited for the user to click on the button. And then what we did was we told JavaScript, look for this part of our website and change what's inside of it to test. And so now I'm just going to duplicate. It's very similar for all three of the other things. So I'll look for image-img, and I'll copy this line over, and then I'll call this description. And so now we have references to the title, the image, and the description. But now we have a problem, right? So we have references to these parts of our website, but we don't really know what to put inside of them, right? Because I don't have a folder of space images on my computer. I don't really have descriptions of the images. I don't really have titles for those images. So that's something I don't have on my computer. I probably won't even have it on my web server. So we need a way for us to get some image or information from elsewhere. And that's where APIs come in. So very basically, APIs are a way for my website to talk to someone else's server or someone else's place on the internet, right? So NASA, thankfully, has their own APIs. So if you could visualize it this way, we could call this little bubble, you could call this like, this is my website, right? So my website does not have any images or descriptions of things in space, but NASA's website also exists here, right? So this is NASA. And so their computers actually have images and descriptions available to us, right? So we need a way for our website to talk to a NASA's website. So we need to establish some sort of connection between these two things. And so thankfully NASA, if they didn't have an API, this would be closed off to everybody else, right? So these images would be closed off to anybody else. And I couldn't go ahead and bypass their firewalls or security to somehow retrieve those images. But a lot of websites will have these things called APIs, and APIs, you can basically visualize them as like little gateways inside of that they've opened up to the rest of the internet. And these gateways have very specific ways that you interact with them. And if we agree to interacting with these gateways in a certain way, NASA will also give us back some information. And so my website will say, I don't know anything about space objects, so I'm going to go ask NASA about a space object. And that's what's called a request. So I'm asking NASA for something, and I'm waiting for a response. And requests have very specific formats, and we'll see what those formats are later. And NASA, if we've formatted correctly, and we also have given NASA a key, which is basically a secret password that hey, I'm a legit person and I'm not a robot, and I actually want this information for useful things. NASA will say, okay, you're good, and I'll return this back from my gateway, and this is what's called a response. And so now, through the response, we have a way to get the information that we were lacking in our request. And now we can display that on our website. So a lot of the time when you're using the API, they'll have some documentation around it. And you'll see that NASA is asking us to generate an API key. And an API key is a secret password that we give to NASA to say, I'm a legit person. And once you have that API key, you can fill this out here and they'll give you an API key. You can start by browsing their APIs. And the one that we'll be using today is the astronomy picture of the day. And this does exactly what we wanted to do, right? So if we read this, it'll say, it gives us images from their NASA website that already displays these images. And you'll see that it's an HTTP request. So remember I talked about request earlier, and HTTP is essentially how we talk to other things on the internet. And we want to ask other things on the internet for the information, right? So the request that we have here is a GET request, which is basically, I want to get some information from something else on the internet. And the GET request has a lot of parameters, right? So remember I was talking about that format of the request that we had to obey. And so we can have different parameters, which are basically different parts that we can add to our question or our request that modify what NASA will give back to us. And so they have an example query here. If I actually click this link, we can see, let me see. Right, so this is the link that I clicked. And we go to api.nasa.gov. And from here, Firefox actually just formats it well for me. But what your computer really sees is this really long string of text, right? So I asked NASA a question, and this is the answer that they gave back to me. And it's really hard to understand, but it has a general format, and this is called JSON, so JSON. And this is generally the way that you'll be given responses back when you get a request, when you give a request to something else on the internet through an API. And if I click the JSON tab, it'll actually format it in a more understandable way for me. And so there's some really important parts that we could use here, right? So there's a title, and there's an explanation for the image. There's also a URL for the image, and if I click this URL, it actually goes to the image and it has the image that we can use earlier. And that's essentially all we need, right? So we need to get this title, this URL, and this explanation. So now how do I do this in JavaScript, right? And so the way that we do this is there's a thing called fetch. So fetch is something that we can initiate a request. You can even see it like has a lot of things that relate to requests, right? So fetch has two parameters, which are like the input to the request, and then also some other parameters that you can specify. And what it will return is a response. And so when I fetch, I can specify a URL that I want to fetch to. And this URL, if we go back to this source code, you can just copy this URL here. This is essentially us giving that question. This is the question that we're asking NASA. And if I copy this URL, essentially what it means is that I want to go to this URL on the internet. This is my key. So this really long string of text is just the key that I got from generating an API key. And I just want one image, right? So count equals 1. And then if I console.log this, which is essentially just printing out what we get from here. And I open the console. And I click here, you'll see it doesn't actually have what we want it to have, right? So it just says it's a promise and it's state pending, because unlike other programs that we might be used to running, this takes time, right? So initiating a request and then getting a response, this will take time. So immediately when we execute this part of the code, it won't actually have the answer right there for us. So what we have to do instead is after this, we include a .then. So I have this fetch, and this is essentially like, you could put this on the same line. You can also put this on a different line, but this .then, what it will do is once we've gotten a response back from the NASA servers, then we can actually do something with it. So what I'll do is, so RES stands for response. And then what I'm doing here is I'm taking the response. And right now the response, as I showed you earlier, was what that raw was. So the raw data. And this isn't something our program can usually interpret, because it's just a bunch of strings, right? So we want to be able to use it in a more convenient manner. And so we can convert it into a JSON. And then we can do another .then. So you can chain these together. And then once we have that, this res is now, it now represents like the more usable version, which is like the JSON version, which we can now use to do some manipulation of our website and have some information. So now once I've gotten that response, what it will do is it'll give us an object which basically has the URL, the title, the HTML, the explanation, etc. And we can just pull from that. So a small caveat about this is that since count equals 1, it won't return one object. It'll actually return us an array that contains one object. So what I'll do now is I'll just say that like, let first object equal res0. So if you've used other languages, this is basically like me taking the first thing on our response, and I'm just putting that into first object. I'll actually call this like, space object, because it makes more sense. And now what we can do is we have these references to these parts of our HTML, right? So we can now use the title that we got from our response. Now we can change the title that shows up as image title. And we can do the same thing for the image and also the description. So what I'll do is I'll set title.innerText equals space object dot title. And now when I refresh, you'll see when I click it, and actually each time that I click it, it'll give me a different title, right? And so now we have some part of the website. So essentially what we've done so far, right? So we've had this HTML, which is a skeleton of our website. Once we've done that, we wanted to add some interactivity to our website. So we wanted this button to actually do something. We added a nerve that inside of here that listened for any time the button was clicked, and we executed all this code. And what this code did was it looked for different parts of the HTML. It initiated a request to NASA servers, right? So this website initiated a request, and NASA gives us a response. It converted it to JSON, right? So it made it into a more usable format for our code. And then it took whatever that response was, and it changed our title to whatever NASA's title was. We can do the same thing for all of the other ones. So we can say description.innerText is equal to space object dot explanation, I think they call it. And then image dot set attribute to the, I think this is, so instead of setting what's inside of the text, right? So instead of setting what's inside of here, we want to change the attribute. And now if I refresh and I click it here, each time it'll give us a different thing, right? So now we have, instead of just saying image title, a random image, and image description, we've used what we've gotten from NASA and just displayed it on our website. So each time it'll give you a different image. And this is essentially like all you need for a website, right? So if you really wanted to just have information on your website, this is all you need. But in my opinion, this doesn't look really good, right? So everything's aligned to the left. There's not much difference in colors and things, and we want to make it look more to our liking. And that's where CSS comes in. So this is all the JavaScript we have. And if you've missed anything, you can refer back to the GitHub, and it should have all these. And so now we can add another file, which is our CSS, which will make our website look a bit better. And I like to call my CSS file style.css. You can call it anything, just like the JavaScript. And before we do anything, in order to ensure that we don't have any mistakes, we'll first tell HTML where our CSS file is. And we can do that inside of the head tag. So we can add a link to our CSS. And this is another like single tag. And it's the relation of that link is a style sheet. And this is just a reference to that, to like where that style sheet is. And style sheets are essentially just a set of rules to how to format our website. And then we can change the styles using that style.css. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to add a different font to my website. And the way that I do that, I usually go to fonts.google. And then I look for a font that I like. Maybe we use Roboto here. And what you can do is that you can look for a style that you like. I'm going to select two styles. So I'm going to look for a regular. And then I'm also going to select a bold one, because I want to have a different font. I want to have these bolded, but I also don't want to have this bolded. So I'll use different ones. And so now Google will tell me, how to import this into my CSS. And what I usually do is I use an add import, which is just, usually what I do is I just copy this line of code right in here. And you'll see that Google also tells me like, this is how you reference this font family. So I'll copy this here. And this just imports that font from Google's API. You'll notice that the fonts, the way that we load fonts is actually through another API. So if you imagine that there's actually another API here, and this is like fonts, that's not how you spell fonts. Fonts, right? And then, so we're actually asking for, we're actually initiating another request and we're getting that font back. And we can also do that through CSS. So now I want to apply this font. So if I don't do anything here, even though my CSS is still loaded, this font won't actually be loaded into my HTML. You know, it looks pretty basic right now. And the way that you change that is that this is basically the most common way. Like, this is how you do anything in CSS. So you basically define which part of the website am I altering, and then how do I want it to look. So this is a selector, we call it. And this is very similar to how we referenced things in HTML from our JavaScript. So we can use the same IDs that we use to reference things in JavaScript in here, or we can just use the name of an element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit everything inside of the HTML, and I'll use that code that Google told me earlier, which I can say the font family is Roboto, and it's also a sans serif font. So if I do this now, you'll notice that the font has changed. So now this looks much better, right? So we've already done something that's aesthetically much more pleasing, and we can do many more things with that. So in my original website, I had a black background color, which I can do now. So I can just say the background is black. And now the text looks like it's disappeared, but it actually hasn't. If I highlight, it hasn't. So we want to change the color of the text now to become white. And you can just do that by saying the color is white. So now the text color is white and the background is black. And you know, the rest of the website still works because we still are using JavaScript and HTML to alter things from the NASA API. So the final thing that I'll do is I'll just center some things because it looks much better in my opinion. So the first thing that I'll do is, since we can put tags inside of other tags, I'm going to create a tag. It's called a div tag. And a div tag doesn't really do anything on its own. What it's used for is that you can add like some sort of hierarchy to your website. So you can say that everything inside of this div tag is somehow related. And I'll give this div an ID, and I'll just call this the container. So this contains everything inside of our website. And now, to reference this container, if I want to edit anything about this container in CSS, the way that you change things about an element using its ID is you use the hashtag, and then you use the ID that you gave it. And so now what I'll do is that I'll say that its width is 60%. And so the width of this container should be 60% of the entire width of the website. And so I think it's right. So if I do this here, right, you'll see that the text is cut off at approximately 60%. And then there's a couple lines that I'll add here. This is kind of more advanced than, but I can add like a margin to this, which will center it a bit better. You'll notice that this image is kind of screwing things up because it's too large, which we can edit that later. But if I have a smaller image, you'll notice that everything is centered and looks a bit better. And finally, I'm going to edit what that image was doing, right? So that image, sometimes it can get way too big and it can mess up how the rest of our website is formatted. So I can give it a maximum width, and I can say that the maximum width is just 100%. And so now 100% in this case means 100% of whatever's around it. So whatever it's inside of. So the image, as referenced here, will be at most 100% of whatever the width of this container is. And then if I specified 60% earlier, and what that means is that the container will be at most 60% of what the body's width is, and so on from there. And so that's pretty much it, right? So this is most of what our website can be. And obviously you can add more things. So in my original website, I did some things where you could center the text inside of here. I think I also centered the image. And if you ever want to look things up for that, like say I want to center text in CSS, a lot of the time there will be some sort of resource that you can use just off of Googling. And W3 Schools usually has a lot of that. And so we can reference a lot of this. The one that you can use is text align center. I won't do that now because as promised, we can use this to deploy to GitHub pages. And so our website, I would say, is essentially finished, right? So we have a button and it's changing according to every time I press it. Sometimes it's weird. And now we'll be deploying this with GitHub pages. So GitHub pages is essentially a service that allows you to deploy your static websites to the web. And a lot of people, if you've ever seen like a link like something.github.io, this means that it's been hosted using GitHub pages. So I'll just call this, I'll call this HackOR. Okay. And you can give this like a description. If you haven't used Git before, this might be a bit too advanced. So, try to follow along, but Git might be sort of more advanced in the scope of this workshop. And I'll just add no description and I'll just create this repository. And now I need to link this to my source code. And so I'm going to initialize my Git repository. I'll add a remote. And this is basically saying that, I want to upload my code to this URL. And then I'm going to add all the files. And I'll just commit this and I'll call this initial. And so now I've committed all the files to my Git repository. And now when I say git push, the first time that you do that, you have to set an upstream. So now it's uploading all those files, and if I refresh, it'll be on my GitHub. And then right now it's not deployed using GitHub pages, but if you go to settings in your repository and you scroll a bit down, you can see a section called GitHub pages. And I can just say that my source branch is the master branch. So this is just the main branch of my GitHub. And if I save this, it takes a bit, but once you save it and you do it correctly, it'll tell you which URL is deployed to. I've done something with my GitHub pages, which it directs to a different website, but for you, it'll say your username.github.io/whatever you called your repository. And for now, that's pretty much it, right? So I go to this repository. If you actually go to this URL on the web, it should show you the same thing that I'm seeing here. So we've deployed something to the web, and this is a website that you've created, and that's about it. So I'm leaving. I can leave this the rest of this time for any questions. I know I went very fast here, so it's really hard to keep pace, but hopefully since this is recorded, you can go back and see which parts that you might not have understood. And if you have any questions, I can answer them now.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Also, Joy had a fantastic one too, so that one should definitely be answered. It's in chat. But I was gonna say, so I really like that you reference like W3 Schools, because I thought that was like a fantastic resource that I've been using a lot. But I was wondering if there's like any other resources that you could give to people who are just beginning in CSS, HTML, learning all of that, because like I'm very overwhelmed. Like I look at everything, I'm like I can Google things, but oh my God, where do I focus? Where what's something I can start on?
Yeah, Lily actually says something in the chat, which was exactly what I was going to reference. So there's a website called CSS-Tricks. And this is essentially like the best resource, I would say, for anything related to CSS. A lot of the times, if you Google something, CSS-Tricks will actually be the first result.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
And so that's for CSS. For JavaScript, I think W3 Schools is pretty good for that. If you've used other programming languages, I would say a lot of just Googling is good as well. That's what I usually do because I don't usually use like a single resource. You can shop around for different things that might answer your question.
Yeah.
And for HTML, I think there's not much that you'd really have to learn, and so W3 Schools should be able to fill that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, the difference between a web app and a website. So I don't really know if there's like a hard difference between those two things, but to my understanding, a web app is basically something that's more interactive than a website. A web app might actually have communication with like another server. It might actually have something else running on the internet, and it might be more interactive than, let's say, a website. And a website is more like a general all-encompassing term, and it also can mean something that's more static and that's more like yeah, like something more static than web app. Okay, and so someone asked a question, which is, do you have to have a premium GitHub account to publish multiple sites? I don't really think you have to, because each repository that you create should be able to have GitHub pages attached to it if it's, the general format of like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. GitHub, like any other server, will look for an index.html, which will be the entry point to your website. So make sure you have that when you're deploying to GitHub pages. My opinion on Stack Overflow, I think I use it on a daily basis, so it's really hard to have a bad opinion about it, but I think it's usually a good resource. I wouldn't say rely too heavily on it, because sometimes the things that people respond to, like the answers to some questions might be a bit too complicated for your purposes, but it's a good starting point. And yeah, Free Code Camp is also really good. They have a good YouTube tutorials and things.
Another question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Cool. I was gonna say too, like so like let's say you have like a pretty good website idea, you want to start on something. What are some places that or platforms that you'd recommend for people to start on that, to like kind of like have an ability to not only like edit the code, but just like have some place to host it? Like I don't know if that's okay to ask, because that might be like free advertisement, but I'm just saying like things you've worked with that have worked really well for you.
Yeah, if you're talking about like services to like deploy to, GitHub pages, a lot of the time, like more often than not, if it's something that doesn't rely on having a backend server, which is another concept in web development that you might hear, GitHub pages can usually satisfy the requirement. And so that should be most of like what you want to use for anything that's related to a static website. For things that do have backend servers, so a lot of the more complicated websites, 99% of the websites that you will visit will have a backend, which is essentially just another server that's running somewhere else on the internet, and you need to communicate with both of them. And so you can still actually host the front end of it on GitHub pages, but the backend, which is like, that other server, might be hosted on something else. Things that I've used in the past that are free or semi-free are a lot of the cloud providers. So, Google has Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, other cloud providers that you might have heard of, like Azure. And then Heroku is a free one that, they have some limits on it, but I think it's pretty good for beginners to start out with. And, those are the ones that I've used and have pretty good experiences with. No problem.